All right, so we're going to keep looking at things associated with the Industrial Revolution today. These are things that are really big deals. These are important things, which doesn't mean that they're hard things. It just means that big picture, if you want to pass the AP exam, you're going to need to know these things. Now, we're going to divide the world into industrial parts of the world and non-industrial parts of the world. Later on, I'll call these the wolves and the sheep, but that's after Christmas story. What we need to know is what happens in all industrial societies. If you're an industrialized state or you're becoming industrialized during this time period, your society is going to undergo massive changes. And these are changes that are deep and profound and still affect the way that we live. You know, in history, sometimes a historical trend can last 700, 800 years. The world's only been industrialized for roughly 200 of them. We're still going through the processes of industrialization. There are still regions of the world that are just now going through industrialization. India, China, these are places that are only really truly industrialized in the last 20 to 40 years. So it doesn't matter if it's period 3 when you industrialize, it doesn't matter if it's period 4 when you industrialize. When you industrialize, your society is going to undergo massive, massive change. And we need to talk about what those changes are. And then we're going to talk about how people react to those changes. So, with the creation of industrialization and with the creation of capitalism, you see the way that people work and live their lives change dramatically. All throughout time, families tended to work together. Maybe you were a farmer, you and your whole family were working. The male and the female would oftentimes work side by side. Or maybe you were a skilled artisan and craftsman, and most of your time was spent in the back in your shop making goods. And maybe once a week you would go to a market and you would be gone. But family units were together. Family units worked side by side. Also, you had hierarchy. The Industrial Revolution is going to change hierarchy in a very, very, very interesting way. All throughout time, hierarchy had pretty much been, as a good rule of thumb, was based on how much land did you own. That's going to change into a mindset that we have even to this day. So let's look at, first thing we want to talk about is new social classes are going to emerge. You're going to see a rising middle class of skilled workers being created. Remember when we talked about capitalism, there were definitely groups of people who capitalism brought up. If you were in the industrialization brought up, if you were a skilled worker or an artisan and you were providing goods that a factory needed, or maybe you were the guy at the factory who knew how to fix the machines, or maybe you had risen to the level in a factory of being one of the bosses. You were part of a new, growing, thriving middle class in industrialized states. What does it mean to be middle class? It means you have enough and some extra. These people had good lives as a rule of thumb. You know, it doesn't mean that it was perfect. It doesn't mean there wasn't times that were stressful, but economically, they were doing well. But what you're also going to see is a growing class of unschooled industrial workers, a new urban worker class. These were the people who had nothing to sell but their labor. They weren't skilled. They didn't know a trade. They weren't artisans. And these people are going to have a really, really, really rough go. And you've never seen a class of urban poor quite like this. All throughout most of history, most of the people who lived in cities pretty decently well off, because to live in a city, you're either an artisan or better. Not so much anymore. And the Industrial Revolution is going to cause a level of class tension that hadn't been seen in a lot of places in the world before this. And it's a deep and profound amount of class tension. You're going to see the way family organization changes. The creation of the so-called nuclear family develops in middle classes. What's that nuclear family idea? Dad goes to work, mom stays home and keeps the kids. I think a lot of people think for some reason that this is historically how people have lived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. That is not true. This is not how family units have traditionally been organized. Like I said earlier, most of the time people are working side by side. But the idea of dad's going to go away 5 or 6 days a week, and we're not going to see him for 8 to 12 hours a day, that's a new phenomenon in world history. And it's going to have dramatic impacts, and it's going to change the role of men, and it's going to change the role of women deeply and profoundly. The idea that a kid just might not see their dad for 60 hours a week, that's a new thing. That's in the middle classes. In the working classes, the low working classes in urban areas, you have a radically different story. These are groups of people who are living right on the edge of profound poverty. And in these classes of people, the man worked sometimes 12 to 16-hour days, and the woman worked, and even in some instances, the children worked. And you can imagine the impact this would cause on family stress and family structure. You guys might go 13, 14 hours a day and never see each other. And by the time you got home, everybody was so tired, you're just ready to crash. And these people did not have extra, and they lived in these terrible cities that we'll talk about later on, in poverty and in crime. And at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, especially, way overworked. In the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, if you were a working class individual, your life expectancy was about 29 years old. That's how awful this life was. And this is an interesting thing. And this goes back to one of the things about Adam Smith. Yes, capitalism and industrialism is growing the wealth of the entire state. There's no doubt. There's no argument for it. Free trade is increasing the wealth of the state. But the question is enough of that wealth getting down and permeating through all society? And that's a question and an answer to a question we're going to talk about later in this period, in this class. So you have this divide. You have this new emerging working class living in great poverty, working god-awful hours in these terrible factories. And the factories were terrible places to work. Long days, dangerous days. If you got hurt, there was no protection for you. You're just going to not get paid for however long till you get back to work. You were easy to replace. If you started saying, hey, I'd like to be raised, they could just fire you because you had no skills, and you have a whole city of workers who are willing to fill in right for your job. So you had no really voice in what you were doing. Other problems with industrialization. Air, for the first time, you deal with air pollution. One of the things that we don't think of is cities is where the factories were. So it wasn't like kind of today in America, we've increasingly put our factories outside of cities in the countryside. But for most industrialized regions, especially during this time period, the factories are in the cities. If you lived in Manchester United, you had 14 different factories puffing God knows what into the air. They said that there was so much smog in Manchester by the end of the 19th century, you could go weeks without seeing the sun. That's miserable. So if you were a working class worker, you're working these godforsaken long hours in these dangerous places. Your family life is pretty miserable because you're all working yourselves to death, and you live in these dank, pollution infested cities. The water was polluted, the air was polluted. And this is the first time where pollution becomes a major global problem that we have to talk about and we have to address. Another big issue that's going to be associated with overly rapid industrialization is going to be the cities grow so fast with so many people flocking to cities for jobs. The cities grow so fast that the cities don't have the infrastructure to deal with all of these large populations that are coming into the city for the first time. So, for example, plumbing. You know what most working class people did with their human waste in the Industrial Revolution? They just threw it into the streets because they didn't have sufficient systems of plumbing for the cities. The whole cities would just smell like crap and pee. And that's what you're walking through. And that's what you're stepping through. When cities become breeding grounds for disease, on top of the pollution problem, on top of the water pollution and air pollution, and you're working yourself to death. And this is how it can be where a working class person's life expectancy is all of a sudden 29. People lived in 1 or 2 room apartments in cities if you were working class. All this time, all this effort, all this work that you and your family were putting in, all it got you was a crappy 1 or 2 room apartment with no indoor plumbing and barely enough money to feed yourself. When I say especially early on, cities are awful. And it's just the truth. And why aren't governments doing anything to regulate these things? In large part, because adherence to the ideas of Adam Smith, which says, hey, the best thing the government can do is leave it alone. Now, in defense of Adam Smith, when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, there weren't factories. It would be really interesting in hindsight to say, okay, wait, if you're Adam Smith, yes, the best thing for trade is to have free trade. And the best government policy is as little policy as possible. But that doesn't mean, I wonder if he would say, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't regulate what factories put into the air. Like, that would be an interesting thing to go back and see. But because he didn't live in an era yet where these things were happening. He was very early on in this time period. So I'm not criticizing Smith. I'm criticizing governments who are just like, well, this is what we believe in now, so we're not going to regulate this. The other thing is that cities become big centers of is crime. When you have lots of groups of people living together in close proximity to one another, and you have a large class of people who are barely hanging on, it's a natural breeding ground for criminal activity. And you're going to see that. This is a common theme of all urban areas, and it's even true today. Urban areas are breeding grounds for crime. And interestingly enough, historically, that wasn't necessarily a truth. But it's a truth with industrialization. When people have nothing to lose and they're desperate, they do desperate things. Violence becomes a real problem in the Industrial Revolution. All sorts of theft. So managing crime and managing poverty become new challenges that industrial governments are going to have to deal with that, frankly, they've never had to deal with before. And again, what's the problem? This class of people who's being left behind by the Industrial Revolution, whose life not only is it getting worse, it's getting a lot worse. Yes, there's a rising middle class. Yes, there's a new class of factories. Like industrialization is the greatest thing that's ever happened. But there's definitely this class of people. And where is this? You see these issues. I want to emphasize this. All of these issues we've talked about happen anywhere that there's industrialization. So the United States will have a problem with this. Cities like New York, Boston, Detroit, St. Louis, Buffalo, Pittsburgh. Everything I've said applies to all those places. England, London, Manchester, Liverpool, France, Marseille, Paris. So even though I haven't necessarily said if it's a major city in these states, so I haven't said anything about Berlin, but I told you that Germany is going to become industrialized in this period. You know that all these statements are true for industrialized Berlin. I haven't told you anything about Russian industrialization, except to say that Russia is industrialized. By the end of this time period, places like Moscow and St. Petersburg are dealing with these issues. Haven't told you anything about Tokyo, about Japanese industrialization. Tokyo has a smog problem by the end of this period. Tokyo has a problem with how families are being reorganized rapidly as a result of the industrialization. These are a common plight across all groups of people. And it's important to know that these are issues amongst class, amongst all these places that industrialize, because there's going to be a person coming soon who's going to have a solution for all the classes of people who are being left behind by the Industrial Revolution. All right? So you have crime problems, you have poverty problems we've associated with this working class, poor housing, disease. Just again, when you're throwing all your crap in the streets, and insufficient infrastructure. What's the main fundamental issue that we're dealing with? Cities are growing too fast. Workers are flocking to cities for work, both from within states. And one of the things you're going to see, and we're going to talk about this later in this class, in this unit, probably after Christmas, is some instances it's people from other countries coming to your cities to work. Eventually, there's going to be a massive global migration that takes place in this time period where people from unindustrialized regions of the world are going to go to industrialized regions looking for work. The United States, in many instances, is the best example of this. Workers from all over the world are going to come to the United States during the Industrial Revolution looking for work. One example of that is going to be my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather grew up in Sicily. He stowed away on a ship, came to New York looking for a better life, and that's how he got here. But where does he end up? He ends up in an industrialized city, New York City, working in a factory. So, when we say people are flocking to industrialized cities all throughout this unit, that doesn't necessarily just mean within a city, a country. Sometimes they're coming from out of the country to these cities. We're going to talk a lot more about that later on in this time period. So, what's the big thing? The big thing is to see people are getting left behind. Not everyone. Again, lots of middle class, great. Upper class, amazing. And there is a new upper class that's created in industrial societies. All throughout this time period, all throughout world history before this time period, who are the upper class? In most places, it's the people who own the land. In the Industrial Revolution, this shifts. Now the upper class is the people who control capital. Who controls the railroads? Who controls mines? Who controls factories? And that's a class of people we've never seen before either. And one of the great issues that we're going to deal with is the clash between this new upper class that's created and the lower classes. And that's going to have massive repercussions. So we're going to start to look at that tomorrow, because we are also in an era of political revolution. So the question might be, hey, Quattro, how come the workers never rise up and do anything about this? And we're going to deal with that in the next couple of days. Hope you guys found this interesting. I'll assign you your work in just a second. You guys have an awesome day.